Hi, my name is Rebekah Covington, and I'll be speaking with Melanie Thompson today. Thank you for joining the webinar Policy Approaches to Exploitation. So today we'll be talking about the Nordic Model approach. This is implemented here in King County. Our goal is to really just educate and make sure that policymakers have the ability to hear from survivors of trafficking, and elevate the voices of survivors to make sure that these voices are heard when it comes to making policy decisions within our cities. So this is the reason why we're doing this webinar series. The Human Collaborative came together with a group of survivors out of the King County, Washington area, I guess, and surrounding area, and allies that are, putting this together, like I said, to educate and to make sure that survivor voices are elevated, and that when policy decisions are made, a survivor has a seat at the table at every aspect of decision making, in that the voices are heard. So the reason that this is so important to me, and the reason that I'm involved in the Human Collaborative, is I am a survivor of human trafficking, and I've been in this work now for about 2 years. I currently finished up a contract at Seattle Against Slavery in Washington. I was doing healthcare alliance work. I was training healthcare providers how to identify trafficking and how to respond in a trauma-informed way. I actually went to school for business and communication at UW and wasn't quite sure the trajectory of where I was going to go with that degree. But as I was nearing my senior year, I was looking into my criminal record and different things surrounding what employment would look like after graduating the university. And I found the CSEC task force at the Superior Court. A woman, she gave me the opportunity to have a 9-month internship in the human trafficking division for the court. And so I did that, and I had the opportunity to meet all the stakeholders within this work throughout King County, all of the allies and survivors pushing forward this work to reduce harm in our society. And I just really got involved in this work and joined the Seattle Human Rights Commission. I'm the co-chair of the Human Trafficking Task Force, along with Eric Gray. And so that's kind of why we're here today. We want to make sure that survivor voices are elevated and that they're heard when it comes to these policy decisions, especially surrounding the Nordic model. This is something that has been a heavy discussion, even in the Seattle area. Should we support full decriminalization, or is there another way? And there is another way. And so today we're going to talk about the Nordic model approach and what that looks like, and why that's the right way and the right approach that we need to have within our cities. All right, so we're going to go into a human trafficking 101. I just want to educate people who are on this webinar and have not had any training or any education surrounding human trafficking, just to build a core understanding of what this is and what this looks like within our city. So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a crime that exploits the vulnerabilities of our youth, of our homeless, of our foster care kids, of anyone. Anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, but it does disproportionately affect marginalized communities. It's a form of modern day slavery. It's a human rights violation to be trafficked. The TVPA Act is one of the first, it is the first federal law that was implemented, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And it states that trafficking, by definition, is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to make an individual work in any industry. So this is broken down into 2 umbrellas. We have labor trafficking and sex trafficking, where adults and children are compelled to work by force, fraud, or coercion, which would encapsulate this labor trafficking. And then for sex trafficking, adults involved in commercial sex trade as a result of force, fraud, or coercion, or minors exploited for commercial sex. So the exception here, if there's someone under the age of 18 and they're involved in a commercial sex act, they are, by law, by the TVPA Act, a victim of human trafficking. So the force, fraud, or coercion legal bar does not need to be met in this instance. So King County currently follows the AMP model. Action means purpose. So what that means, if someone's induced recruited, harbored, transported, provided, or obtained by the means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercial sex or labor services, so sex or labor trafficking, they are by law a victim of human trafficking, or any minor engaging in commercial sex. And a commercial sex act is defined as the exchange for sex for anything of value. So this could be money, this could be a candy bar, this could be clothing, a place to stay, anything. So who are the victims? Victims can be anyone. It could be someone that grew up in an affluent family or someone from a poor community, although it does affect, like I said, marginalized communities. So it could affect anyone from, that has a high educational background as an adult, or it could affect someone being manipulated into this as a child. So who are the buyers and who are the traffickers? Traffickers can be anyone as well. It can be family members, friends, neighbors, religious leaders, boyfriend or girlfriend, diplomats, businesses. We see this in massage parlors, gangs, or anyone buying or selling sexual services from a minor. So if there's an adult buying sexual services from a minor, they are by law the buyer and the trafficker, and they'll be prosecuted as so. And Washington State has some of the harshest laws currently, making it a felony and having to register as a sex offender. As far as buyer demographics, most buyers in this area are white, are 80% white, they're male, they're married, and they have a higher education, so they know about the harms of this crime. They know what they're doing, and they still do it anyway. The majority are from professional business sectors, information technology, and construction fields. So, buyers can be anyone as well, but the demographics do show that it's mostly 80% white males. As far as statistics go, a lot of times we'll see national statistics because it's very hard to gather information locally in communities, especially on CSEC, on our youth. So, but what we do see is that Washington has the 13th highest trafficking cases within the US. And one of the reasons that trafficking is so prevalent here, a lot of people say, does this even happen here? Like, I don't see it. And lucky for you that you don't see it, but it does run rampant and it is prevalent, and it can be an online, crime. It can be something that happens on the streets, but it does happen in our communities. And some of the reasons are that King County is a major entry point for immigrants, asylees, refugees, with a high concentration of communities that are vulnerable to trafficking. Because when you come here from another country, you may not speak the language. You don't have family around. You have no safety net. You don't know your environment well. So if you are in a situation where you're being exploited, you don't have access to some of the things that, someone might have that is a local. We're also a major hub for technology and development companies. So some people that come from other countries have different ideologies surrounding sex buying. And so when they come here, they think that in their mind that it's okay to buy another human being. So that's one of the reasons why we see that. Dr. I'm gonna get this out. Dr. Deborah Boyer, she did a study recently, and she found that 300 to 500 youth are being trafficked in King County annually, which means on any given day. And 2,000 to 3,000 adults are being trafficked as well, annually or on any given day. And statistics also show that the average age of entry is continuously dropping. You'll see different studies that say the age of 12, 13, 14, as low as 11. What we do know is that the average keeps on dropping. So the entry point of people getting into this life is at such a young age. So I just want to briefly go over the Nordic model, what we're talking about today. So what the Nordic model is, it's a model that actually is from Sweden. It was spearheaded here by the efforts of a man named Val Ritchie, and he's now doing work overseas. But what this model implements is a more holistic approach to this crime. It approaches it in a way that we're talking about trafficking, we're talking about resources, and we're talking about the harms of buyers. So it decriminalizes those who are prostituted. It provides support services for people to exit when they are able to, or when they can, and makes buying people for sex a criminal offense in order to reduce the demand that drives sex trafficking. So instead of criminalizing the women who are being prostituted, we know that the perpetrators are not the women. It's the traffickers and the buyers causing the harm. So that's what we're going to curb with this model. And Melanie will talk, much more into this as she goes into her presentation. And I just want to go over some statistics in King County as well on exploitation cases of minors. So in 2009, a CSAM law was introduced to make the commercial sex buying of children illegal, to mirror the TVPA Act. And so as we see that these numbers start to go down. And in 2012, when the Nordic model was implemented, I know things take time to implement, but as soon as that was implemented, you see these numbers drastically dropping. And as in 2015, there were no children being arrested for prostitution. And this is what we hope to see for people being prostituted and trafficking in general, is that we're not criminalizing people who are being harmed. We want to make sure that those who are harming are the ones that are gonna, have repercussions. So Melanie, I'm gonna hand this off to you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Okay, so these are just 3 terms that I like to include. Sex trafficking is the vehicle that drives prostitution, and I think that needs to be emphasized. And we like to say at my job that you can be in prostitution having never been trafficked, but when you're trafficked, it's almost always for the purposes of prostitution. There are many different definitions of prostitution when you Google it, but I like to use this one because of the term enterprise. A lot of people, I think we need to call it out for what it is. And honestly, when you call it an enterprise, then you get to see prostitution as a system as opposed to an individual choice, which then helps you recognize that it's a system that thrives on other oppressive systems. Hence why I put sex work in quotations, because now you could recognize that sex can never be work and that there is no agency and autonomy if prostitution is already a system that was in place that targets vulnerabilities. So on the left, I have something very similar to what Rebekah was saying about the push factors and the precursors that really affect marginalized communities and them getting into prostitution. So it can happen to anybody, but the sex trade disproportionately targets Black and brown women and girls and children. Over 40% of the population of people in prostitution are LGBTQ plus identifying folks. Well over 30% of children and people that were in prostitution have either been in the foster care system or are currently or were homeless at some point. Immigrant and undocumented populations, anyone who struggles with substance abuse disorder, anyone with a sexual abuse history, all of these things are precursors and pathways of entry into prostitution. And this stat remains the same amongst many people, but over 80% of sex buyers are white, middle-aged men with disposable income, many of which who have an education or higher education, many of whom are married. So there are many different frameworks that govern prostitution in different places. On this slide, I'm gonna just focus on criminalization. Criminalization is what we currently have in all of the 50 states, with the exception of a few counties in Nevada where prostitution is legal in the legal brothels there. So currently under criminalization, the person that's prostituted gets arrested. That arrest leads to a criminal record. There are currently under criminalization no services for people in or people who wish to exit the sex trade. And because of their prostitution criminal record, they face a lot of discrimination or ostracization, hence why it's harder for us to get jobs, get housing, or you're discriminated against because of the history that you have on your record. So I wanted to emphasize this slide because a lot of people don't recognize that. A lot of people think that decrim, full decriminalization, and full legalization are different. In the current argument and in the current push for full decrim, a lot of people like to say But we're not talking about legalization. We're talking about full decriminalization. And what I want to point out is that although they're different in name, and although they have a slight difference, the reality and the results of both of these legal frameworks are the same. And that is that they remove the consequences and the punishment for sex buyers. So regardless to whether or not it's fully legalized in places like Germany and Amsterdam, or if it's fully decriminalized, like what a lot of people are pushing for and what we've seen in certain places, both in and of themselves remove the punishment for sex buyers, therefore we're telling the world that that makes it okay for people to continue purchasing sexual access to our bodies. I also want to make note that we did have one state in the US that attempted or tried full decriminalization, and that was in Rhode Island. But what ended up happening is that in 2009, they reversed the law entirely back to criminalization because of all of the harmful and negative effects that they've seen with decrim. They've seen the increase in trafficking, they've seen more violent sex buyers, and they've seen more people feeling entitled to do what they want to women's bodies because they knew that they had no punishment under decrim. So if full decrim is implemented in any of our states or countries, this is what we're going to see happen. We're going to see these irreversible opposite effects of what we intend to do. So this slide is, I called it sex work with a question mark because a lot of people are debating on whether or not this should be the term that we use, and if we want to fully decriminalize quote unquote consensual sex work. They try to differentiate sex work from prostitution and trafficking. So if you look at the top where the text is in black, this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights definition of decent work. And it says that decent work is full of dignity, equality, and fair income. It says that it's safe and puts people at the center of development. It says that it gives that employee a voice and provides them with the right to be protected from exploitation. And it seeks to provide those employees with a future that's inclusive and sustainable. So now further down here in the white, what you see is exactly how prostitution is the opposite of everything that was listed in that definition. So there is no dignity in the sex trade, and I think that that in and of itself is self-explanatory. Prostitution is a system that is fueled and thrives on other oppressive systems, being misogyny, patriarchy, capitalism, and in some countries, classism, hence all of that being the opposite of equality. Prostitution is not safe, and you'll hear that on both sides, and from both those who identify as consensual sex workers and those who identify as being trafficked or trafficking victims. Prostitution isn't safe, and you cannot regulate a person's body. The only thing that you can regulate is the state taxes if you were to fully decriminalize prostitution as a trade. Prostitution does not put the exploited person in the quote unquote center of development. We do not sit around at a table and decide the laws and the policies and the way in which prostitution is going to work. In fact, it is the traffickers, the perpetrators, the sex buyers who control what, when, and where something happens in prostitution. And also, prostitution is not sustainable. There is no gainful employment in prostitution. So there's no way to get promoted. There are no benefits. So this is not something that can sustain itself, which is why so many people need resources once they exit, and why relapse is so prevalent in those who have exited the sex trade, because there are no resources put in place, and prostitution doesn't set you up with a benefits package afterward. You know, I hear things in New York all the time like, oh, we love this, don't control my body, it's my agency, it's my autonomy, etc., etc. That's all false. One, because, and you know, I have to get this out because a lot of people love to say, you know, sex negative people, carceral feminists, SWERFs, which is a term that they use that stands for sex worker and exclusionary radical feminist. That's what I'm called out here. You know, it's not that we're sex negative. The issue is that sex goes back to this definition of equal mutuality, and you don't have that in prostitution. Prostitution can't be a job like any other if you're not given any of these things in place, and if it's a system that is that is based on and thrives upon gender-based violence. So it cannot be something that we can say we're just going to slap a 401k onto it and make it work, because this is the only quote unquote job that continues to use your body over and over again. You can continue to sell a product that has no repercussions on the product that you're selling. But when you continuously sell a person, one, it's inhumane and immoral, honestly, but it also has negative effects on that person. Hence why, and this is something I didn't include in this slide, but if the average lifespan of a person in pornography is 3 months, despite popular belief. So I wanted to end this very, very short presentation with this. So we call this now the equality model. It's still known as the Nordic model in many places. You might hear it as the Swedish model, the abolitionist model, the partial decriminalization model, or the sex buyer law, depending on where you are. The name, we progressed and changed the name to equality model because it expanded past just Nordic and Swedish countries. Currently, the equality model is implemented in 8 countries, and they all have been proven successful. It pioneered in Sweden in 1999, and Sweden had, at the time before the equality model, 80% of sex trafficking related deaths. With the equality model, that dropped down to less than 1%, and that is a stat as of 3 years ago. And similar to what Rebekah mentioned, the Nordic model or the equality model, it decriminalizes the person that's in prostitution while simultaneously keeping the penalties for perps and exploiters. It allocates funding for aftercare services and resources for exited survivors should or when they exit. And it removes that stigma of being a criminal because there's no prostitution-related criminal arrest that's associated with that. And one of the things I like to emphasize when I talk about the equality model is that middle bullet point about allocating funding for services. Because even if you're on the fence about which legal framework is the best to combat this issue, even if you supported full legalization or full decriminalization or criminalization, none of those offer any type of funding for aftercare services. And I think that, for people that don't, me, Rebekah, we do this work all the time. So of course this is second nature to us, but many people on the street don't really have this conversation every day. So when you hear about this issue, a lot of people will say, full decriminalization is better for sex workers, or, this doesn't, it's a good way to not penalize the person in prostitution and giving them and letting them keep their agency and autonomy. Even if you wanted to support those legal frameworks, it still doesn't offer you any type of services or resources that you need to live a sustainable life. So the equality model is the only one that is tried, tested, proven successful, and it's the only one, honestly, that makes sense. It helps the individuals that are in this system, and to be fair, or to be honest, I should say, a lot of people that I've spoken to that identify as consensual sex workers are all there. If you actually listen and get down to how they got there in the first place, they may use different terminology. They may not want to align themselves with someone who supports the Nordic model. But if you listen to actually how they got there, it's really trafficking. Many of the consensual sex workers that are there and currently in prostitution all will say things like, I started doing survival sex when I was 15 because I was kicked out of my home because I'm LGBT identifying. And what we find is that although the language is different, that's still trafficking under federal definition. And I want to say that I will never say that there aren't people in prostitution that are there strictly by choice with no prior precursors or push factors. However, they only represent less than 2% of the population of people in prostitution. So I want to emphasize that, because so many people say, well, I have a friend who does it, who wasn't raped, or I have a friend who's not Black or not poor, and she decided to strip, or she decided to webcam, et cetera, et cetera. They exist. I will not say that they don't. But when you're talking about laws and implementing legal frameworks, you need to implement these things for the majority of people. They do not represent the majority, and it's that false narrative that it's happy-go-lucky that hurts and further puts at risk all of the marginalized community that is actually being targeted and is already more at risk and more susceptible to being trafficked and being put into prostitution. So I just wanted to say that this is, like I said, the shortest PowerPoint you've ever heard. This is the last of it. And I think now I'm just going to throw it back to you, Rebekah, so we can open it up for questions and discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think one of the things that rang true to me, I know that the Nordic model, the equality model, is more of a holistic approach and to trafficking, and it addresses these on-ramps and off-ramps, but you said regulation doesn't work. And I think the studies that I've researched, you know, it's increased trafficking. Actually, when you fully decriminalize, you see trafficking increase. Is there any countries or studies that you know of that you could kind of quote where this has been, where this has happened?
Definitely. So currently I have a colleague in South Africa who has a program out there where they have full decriminalization, and a lot of the women that were for it are now trying to get into her organization, which is anti it, because of the harmful effects that they've had. We've seen this in the counties in Nevada where prostitution is legalized in those brothels. A lot of the women go in, most of them are trafficked, a lot of them come from California. But I know a lot of individuals that were there that went into the brothels, quote unquote, consensually, and saying that they did this for whatever reason, however, are really desperate to get out and seek our services and seek our help because of because of how harmful the sex buyers are and because of how entitled they are, due to the fact that they know they have no repercussions. We see this also in places like, Australia. Well, certain parts of Australia. Australia does have a very large consensual sex work population, but there are a lot of places in Australia where we see this happening, as well as France and Sweden. Sweden's numbers have definitely decreased now that the equality model has been implemented, but they also saw that type of issue as well.
Yeah. And this is what I continue to see. And so it definitely baffles me how I live in a city in Seattle, how I see my council members supporting full decriminalization. And I think one of the issues is that they're not being properly educated, and they're not listening to the voices of survivors, the survivors who have not only lived that life, whether it's through survival sex, through trafficking, whatever that form looked like, but also had an exit ramp off and now live a fulfilling life. I know that I'm one of the first people in Seattle, one of the first adults who have actually had her, you know, I have a large criminal record from being arrested when I was younger. I was an adult, you know, I was 18. And so that record followed me, and it made it hard for me to get jobs and housing and all of these things. But I was one of the first people in Washington state to actually use the trafficking law to vacate my record, you know, and this is something that is, we need more of it. We need more people pushing for this. We need to see more services. And I'm not saying that this Nordic model is perfect.
Right.
You know, we do need to see more services and more companies doing vacatur and more access to lawyers, and, you know, so people can have this off ramp into this life, this flourishing life that we all want, you know, and have true autonomy over our life without having to sell our bodies, you know. And so what would you say to a council member to get them to kind of understand, you know, from a survivor's perspective? I know I said my piece, but to say to them, to help them, to educate them, to help them understand past this popular belief that
Right.
it's.
So actually, we see that a lot here as well. There's a lot of politicians that we have here in New York and in DC that were pushing for full decrim, and I think that I would start by telling them that they're misinformed, and it's not to negate the narratives that they've heard from consensual sex workers, and I would never take that away from them. But what I find, at least out here, is that a lot of people, politicians and assembly people, they're supporting full decrim because of the fact that it decriminalizes the person being sold or the person in prostitution, and they don't recognize that it also takes away those criminal penalties for the perpetrators. And then there are some who are aware of that and still support it. And at least in New York, what we find is that the largest crowd right now out here in this state that is pushing for full decrim are the the white women with the privilege that are identifying as sex workers, or a very large Black and brown trans population that is pushing for full decrim. And because of the trans population, we currently have a walking while trans ban bill and a vacatur bill. And what the trans community, or the I should say the pro-sex work community out here is doing, is putting both of those laws, the full decrim and the walking while trans ban, etc., together, and going to testifying to these politicians and saying, if you want to support trans individuals, you need to support all of this. And I think that a lot of people don't do enough research. So what they think they're doing is being progressive and listening to survivors, and they think that they are helping this marginalized community because they said decriminalize it because that's what we need, but they're not doing the research, and they're not recognizing how full decrim is going to reverse everything that they're intending to do. So a lot of them, I think, haven't heard enough from survivors, are refusing to listen to survivors. There are some politicians that are sex buyers themselves, so of course they're going to support anything that promotes prostitution, and I think that needs to be emphasized. We don't talk about that enough. But also, I think it's because they're only hearing one side and thinking that they're actually doing good, and they're not recognizing that it's actually going to have the irreversible effects.
Yeah, I know that there was a bill that was passed by some, or not passed, excuse me. There's a bill that was introduced for full decriminalization in Washington, D.C. And I think this was like last year or the year before. It immediately got shelved after 17 hours of testimony. What do you think the deciding factor was with that? Do you think survivor voices were finally heard and elevated? Or, I read the Topo study on, does the public really truly support full decriminalization? Or are we just seeing this in pockets of very liberal cities? Like the Topo study, said that, this research demonstrated that voters are strongly opposed to fully decriminalization.
Right. So I actually was at that hearing. We were there for 14 hours. It went longer. I had to leave after 14 hours, but it was 17 hours of debates, over 150 testimonies, both sides in the room. It was a very high stress situation. And it was very close to passing. I think it was like one vote away from being passed into law. I can't say, I don't know exactly what the deciding factor was. I want to say that survivors were heard that day, but I also recognize that the pro-sex lobby was also very much heard. We knew in that particular hearing for a fact that one of the council members that was voting was a sex buyer, and one of the consensual sex workers pointed him out, like called him out while she was testifying. And I think shortly after this day concluded, he resigned or stepped down or whatever he did. And I think that also helped the vote. But I know afterwards, we also, the anti-prostitution lobby, we also sent a lot of follow-up letters and statements and petitions and things, reasons why we shouldn't have decrim implemented. In terms of the Topo study, I know that I would say honestly that most people don't support prostitution or support trafficking for that matter. I think that what's happening is that the pro-sex lobby is louder than the anti-prostitution lobby. And it's not that they outnumber us, it's more so that people, first of all, sex sells, right? Everybody likes the happy stories. Nobody wants to hear about the fact that we were trafficked or that we were mentally abused. And when people do want to listen to trafficking and hear about trafficking, they automatically it's assumed that it's in ways like in the movie Taken. We're automatically chained to bars and basements, or you hear the Wayfair conspiracy and we're thrown into back of white vans. And people don't want to recognize that the reality is that, especially in the 50 states where a lot of these cities are modernized, prostitution doesn't necessarily always look like that. And trafficking doesn't always look like me being chained up. Sometimes it's that mental abuse that keeps having me relapse. Sometimes it's that connection to your pimp. Sometimes there's so many different factors that go into it that a lot of people don't want to recognize. And are still some people that don't think that it happens in the city. They think it happens in underdeveloped countries or in places outside of the borders. So I think that a lot of people want to support this narrative of, if you pass this law, everybody will be okay. we'll be happy, trafficking victims will be saved, and everything will be great. And I think that because of that, it's, it's a lot easier to accept that than to hear, if we do this, we're gonna look like, Times Square back in the 70s. And they don't want to hear that. It's a lot easier to accept that happy-go-lucky story than it is to recognize the realities of these things that are happening in our backyards, especially when it could imply that you in your community is not doing enough. So I think that that's the reason why this full decrim and consensual sex work narrative is being so, well, one, so heavily debated, but two, so widely accepted, because it's easier to hear, you see somebody that doesn't look like you, that is claiming that they're in prostitution by choice. It's all agency and autonomy. This is what you need to support us, and then you support it. But a lot of people don't want to do that research. A lot of people don't want to speak to people like us, because we check them, we put them in their place, and we let them know, like, you're not doing enough or you're wrong on this, and they don't want to hear that. So I think that that's, at least in New York, that's definitely why it's being considered, because I feel like 10, 15 years ago, even though this was a debate, nobody was talking about it, nobody was debating it, and now it's so heavy. So I think that's partially the reason why it's so loud. But the reality is, majority of people don't support, pimps and sex buyers and traffickers having no penalties or having no punishment.
Yeah. I think one of the things, I think survivor voices, it's so important to listen, like I said, to people who have lived this. And one of my questions was for you, or do you feel, and I want to comment on this too, but do you feel that survivor voices are elevated, not just in this decriminalization topic, but within policy that's being passed in New York? And I know that it takes mobilization, it takes people coming together, and, this can be, it can take time, but I know that even for right here in Seattle, we recently, City Council repealed a loitering law. Mm-hmm. And that sounds great, and that's amazing on so many levels. But right. When you break down the law, you forget to look at the law where it says procurers
right
on there. So procurers are the men that are driving around, loitering, looking for children or adults to purchase on the streets.
Exactly.
So you just throw out that law completely without fully reading it and understanding the ramifications of that. And not only that, the dismantling of what could possibly look like full decriminalization without doing the research,
right.
By getting rid of that hanging of law. And I think that I testified against it. There are some things that I believe, but I had to do so to get counsel to understand that you need to fully look at this whole thing. You need to look at it completely. You can't just look at popular belief. Like, you need to also listen to survivors, because we know we've lived it. We understand it. And I think that, I hope that we'll see more of that. And this is one of the steps to these webinar series, is educating people so that they understand that there's not just one or two voices that need to be heard. The voice of someone like me and you, who have actually lived it and experienced it and are out now, need to be elevated as well.
Right, absolutely. I agree, and I don't think that, I will say in New York we've been progressing in the sense that we've been trying to include survivors in a lot of our lobbying and things of that nature. I do my best to get every survivor I know on board. But generally, I don't think that survivors are at the table enough. We're not in these rooms when they're making policies and decisions. And, when they do listen to a quote unquote survivor, they're only listening to one type, the one that fits that picture for them. But they need to recognize that there's a vast majority of us that look very differently in all different walks of life. And, some may be more well-versed than others. Some may do advocacy work. Some may have never touched it. But I think that it's super, super imperative, especially for politicians and policymakers, to include that vast disparities between all of us, and hearing all of the different types of stories, so that you better know how to assess your community and make effective decisions based on the people that come from there, not the movies that you watch, not the statistics that you read. And I have to comment on that, because a lot of people love stats. I don't like stats, especially when it comes to human trafficking, because there's so many people that are unaccounted for in those statistics. Now, granted, the 80% for sex buyers, that statistic is never going anywhere, because that's the reality. But when it comes to the marginalized community, so many people are not counted, they're undocumented, they're being hidden, they're dead, you don't know. So I think that it's really, really important to listen to as many voices as possible in your communities as a policymaker, but also to listen to the survivors that are telling you all of the negative parts of the sex trade, not just the ones that sound happy, but you need to hear all of us and you need to include us in that. I recognize that I can't just go next to, the president and make a law with him, but it is important that, especially in local government and, mayors and assembly people, that you really include survivors at that table.
Exactly. I agree. As far as the Nordic model, what do you see? Well, there are positive impacts definitely that are seen across, the United States because of the implementation of the Nordic model in different places. What positive impacts do you see in New York?
So right now, the equality model, Nordic model, is not implemented here. We're still under criminalization. We are pushing for the equality model to be implemented. Last year, January, they introduced the full decrim bill with a couple of assembly members and a state senator here, who is, she is a piece of work. And she is whatever, that's another conversation. But
Yeah.
they introduced that bill, and there was a lot of lobbying back and forth in Albany, which is our capital here, to get that passed. And then there was us who was against it, and it was very close to passing. It had a lot of bipartisan support. However, thank goodness to COVID-19, all of that got shut down. So the bill was tabled, and now I'm hearing that it's planned to be reintroduced in our upcoming legislative session. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but I can say that in terms of the countries where the equality model or Nordic model is currently implemented, like I said, in Sweden, the sex trafficking related deaths have definitely decreased. We see services for women. There's a lot more reintegration programs into society for women who have exited the sex trade, which is something that criminalization, legalization, and decrim all don't provide or allocate funding for. And I think that's super imperative, because you can take the person out of prostitution, but then what do you do with them? This is why there's nothing in place, which is why so many people end up going back. So I think that what we've seen in Ireland, what we've seen in France, what we've seen in Sweden, Canada, we've seen a lot of people that were prostituted get jobs, get their records vacated, or expunged. We've seen people go back to school. We've seen women being reunited with their children. We've seen a decrease in trafficking related deaths. And we've also seen a decrease in buying, in the demand, because people don't want to go to jail. People don't want to pay fines. So I think that having that in this state is the only, and in this country, honestly, is the only model that makes sense. And I think we need it.
Yeah, I agree. You brought up COVID as well. I know that within Seattle, because of COVID, there's been so many, more hardships for our youth and our adults that are out on the streets. What does that look like over in New York?
It's the same for us. People are definitely struggling. There is, I don't want to call it a rumor, but people are saying that there are articles that have come out that are saying COVID has negatively impacted quote unquote sex workers, and that because of COVID, their business has decreased. What I find is it's actually the opposite. Um, Pimps, traffickers, exploiters, what they're doing is actually using COVID to their advantage by using it as a manipulation tactic and saying, I know you're broke right now. I know there's no food stamps for you. I know you're hungry. I know you can't pay your rent. Come with me and let me help you get this happening. And sex buyers honestly are so entitled, and have this sense of this sense of entitlement to us, that make them say, well, I know you, same thing as the traffickers. I know you need this money, so come and see me. So actually what's happening is that it's really just business as usual with COVID. It has impacted, people wearing masks and people that aren't in prostitution. It's been impacting their jobs and their families. But for a lot of people that are on the streets and that are in the sex trade, it's really just pimps and sex buyers using this as a way to keep them there.
Yeah. Um, I know we definitely see that a lot here in Seattle as well.
Yeah.
Um, I found this, So Ty, one of our leads, he found a video that you had made where you're talking about Fosta Sesta, and I just wanted to bring that website up, and that whole holding, websites accountable. If you could talk a little bit about that, you were definitely involved in that takedown of like Backpage and all of that. Can you discuss that just a little bit? Because we're talking about the harms of buyers and the violence, and this kind of plays into that. And there's different views that sex workers have and people who are being trafficked have, or survivors have, when it comes to this whole topic and issue.
Right. So so I was very happy that Fosta Sesta was passed. I don't know if everybody on the call knows what Fosta Sesta is, but so Fosta is Fight Online Sex Traffickers Act, and Sesta is Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, and the only difference is that one is federal and one is state. But what it did was not repeal, but it amended Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. And what the Communications Decency Act did was shield websites like Backpage from being held accountable for trafficking, because the clause stated that that the websites were not responsible for third-party content. So they can argue, at that time, they could argue in court, we didn't know this person was being trafficked because we were not responsible for their posting of the ad. When they were knowingly facilitating prostitution and making a profit and putting that money into offshore accounts. So now what Fosta Sesta did was repeal that so that they now are held accountable if they're knowingly facilitating prostitution. What I found, so I'm coming to you with the perspective of somebody who was trafficked as a child and as an adult. I have the experience on the street, in underground strip clubs, and on Backpage and on websites alike. And on those websites, what I found is that all sex buyers are violent and bad and trash, but majority of the sex buyers came from Backpage.com. And what these websites have done is, one, provide them with this privilege of anonymity, and two, has increased the amount of sex buyers that come and purchase you. And that is because of the fact that they can remain anonymous, so they can continue to go. And the way Backpage works, your ad keeps going back up to the top every time you pay. So these are men who are serially looking for people to continue purchasing sexual access to their body, and websites like Backpage have given them that anonymity so that they can continue to use that platform to keep exploiting individuals. So for me, Fosta Sesta was necessary. A lot of times when people hear about trafficking or about prostitution, they still have a very old school picture in their head of what that looks like. And a lot of times you focus on the harms of the pimps. We know that pimps and traffickers are harmful, but a lot of us and a lot of people are not talking about the harms of demand. The people, granted, it is harmful when pimps put us into prostitution. It's harmful when we don't make our quotas, the punishments that we go through, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not talking about what happens behind closed doors. We're not talking about the men that are actually paying with their money, what they're doing to us, the entitlement that they have. And I can go on and on for hours about horrific stories of what these men have done to me or said to me because they felt like for the time that they've paid for, they own me. And a lot of people don't recognize that, and a lot of people don't talk about how they're harmful. A lot of people try to sympathize with them and say, well, hurt people too. And I tell people all the time that say that, well, all of us survivors were hurt people, and we're not choosing to re-exploit. We're not choosing to buy somebody. We're not choosing to buy sexual access to their bodies. So for me, I focus on demand a lot, and I need people to understand that the internet has made it so much easier for sex buyers to remain anonymous, yet still commit the crime at a higher rate.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with you. I mean, I got into a conversation recently with someone, and we were, there's such a divide in the full decrim and the Nordic model, kind of in what those are. And I think we do agree on some things. We'd agree that there's an agreement that, women shouldn't be arrested for prostitution and that services should be provided. This is understood on both sides, but the divide is the buyers.
Mm-hmm.
Divide is the buyers. When people don't talk about, I'm glad you brought this up, the harm that buyers cause. because I will say that the buyers out there caused more harm to me. I had more guns pulled on me and knives pulled on me, and I was I've had more harm caused by the buyers than my trafficker ever did to me. Not
Mm-hmm.
that he didn't, but the buyers were they were the majority of
Yeah.
where the abuse and where the, harm came from. And
And
so,
I tell people that all the time. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I tell them that all the time because they don't believe it. And it's like, I told them, granted, I used to get beaten a lot by my trafficker, right? Because of whatever punishment, I didn't do something right, whatever. But when I'm behind closed doors and a sex buyer wants more time that they didn't pay for, or they want you to do something that you don't like doing, that's when I saw that knives pulled on me. That's when I saw guns pulled out. That's when I saw trying to keep me hostage and blocking the door, things like that. So a lot of people, I think that we're not shedding enough light on them. And I think that people are just viewing them as average folk that go to work because, again, they live average lives outside of what they're doing to us. They're married, they go back to their kids. A lot of them are doctors, lawyers. They go back to their jobs. So people are not shedding light on them or paying attention to the harms that they're causing. But I think that it's if survivors, if we were again included in these conversations at the table, then people would be more educated on it. But because we're left out, they don't have that proper information. They don't have that narrative.
yeah, I agree. I know in Seattle we've been having talks, just because of the division that there is, and we don't want to see, two parties like, sex workers and survivors and just pitting, trauma against trauma and different
Right.
panel conversations. That's not what we want.
No.
So we've been having talks like how do we come together without, obviously breaking down every core moral and belief that we have, and also just finding a way to come together. So our ideas were, is there a third way? Is there a different model that needs to be created to create less division while still reducing harm for, those in society?
To be honest, that I think that's the question all of us in all of these states are trying to figure out. I feel like the equality model is the third way.
Yeah.
Because otherwise any new model that we create would have to be one, if we're trying to mend both sides and cater to that, it wouldn't be one that doesn't include legalizing or decriminalizing something in the sex trade. And I don't support that. And I think what I've recognized is that a lot of people who identify as consensual sex workers, when I talk to them, the ones who were receptive to that conversation, a lot of them didn't recognize their trauma. And I tell people all of the time, a lot of people, if you asked me at 16, if I was doing this life by choice, I would have told you hell yes. And that's because as a person that goes to the sex trade, in order for you psychologically to continue to go through paid rapes consistently and repetitively, you have to tell yourself that you are in control of what's happening. Otherwise, you'll break down and you cannot get through the day. And I have some scientific research and medical research that backs that up. But you have to tell yourself that you're in control, hence why you grasp onto the narrative of agency and autonomy. Again, I will never say that there aren't people that are in that, but they represent less than 2%. So the question really becomes, why is 98% of individuals that are in prostitution coming from these marginalized communities? And why are we trying to consider putting or implementing a policy that favors the same exact systemic oppressions that put them there in the first place? Why are we trying to implement a policy that supports people taking advantage of the vulnerabilities of those from marginalized communities? Why are we even debating this topic? Granted, right? Like, and I tell people all the time, there are a lot of laws in place that are anti something, and there's always somebody that disagrees, right? There are good, like in New York State, it's very hard to get a gun license out here compared to other states. A lot of people that like to shoot want that law to go away, but they recognize that the majority of what's happening here are a lot of issues related to gun violence. So you implemented that policy for the majority of people. So why is it that when it comes to prostitution or anything regarding a woman's body, we now have all of this debate? The reality is the majority of people in prostitution are getting hurt, getting shot, being killed, getting raped repeatedly, suffering all of these different issues, whether it be medically, physically, or psychologically. So why are we not implementing this policy that supports this medical and scientific narrative. Why, like, granted, somebody can say, you know, I was stripping just because, right? Because I was bored. And we know that that's not the majority of the cases, but I'm not going to cater to that one person who said that when there's another 3,500 people that are suffering. You know, I'm not going to, so to me, I feel like there's always going to be a debate and there's always going to be this division. I try my best in my personal capacity when I come across or come into contact with people who identify as consensual sex workers. I try to focus on what we have in common. One, it's trauma bonding, and that's really unfortunate. But whether you consider yourself a trafficking survivor or you consider yourself somebody who engaged in survival sex, the reality is you were under 18, you were kicked out because of your sexual orientation, you're a foster youth, you're homeless, you're a runaway, whatever have you. And we all suffered something that put us there in the first place. Nobody wakes up and says, I want to be in prostitution as my career choice. That's just not how reality is. That's not the reality. 9 times out of 10, you have to be pre-exposed to prostitution and or you know, trafficked into prostitution. This is not, it's not a natural choice. So I think that a lot of times we're not focusing on the precursors and the oppressions that that us and marginalized communities go through to even get to that point, but we're so focused on trying to cater to the narrative without doing deeper research and figuring out how this person got there. Like I said, when I was 16, I said I was doing all this by choice, and I had to tell myself that I was in control. So I said, yeah, it's my body, it's my choice, it's my autonomy, without recognizing that I'm a 16-year-old in foster care that comes from this very poor background. So people are not recognizing those factors that lead them to that point. And I think that, you know, the equality model for me is the way. It's, again, all laws have its flaws, but at the very least, this is a starting point and a step in the right direction compared to the others.
Exactly. I think something for me is when, you know, when I was being trafficked during that time, there were no services out there for me to exit. There was no one to help me. You know, I mean, when the cops did a house raid on our, you know, and came in throwing smoke bombs and had guns on all of us, like there was no, you know, how, you know, can we get you into services? Can we help you? It was like, you know, threats against our life. Like if you don't tell on this guy, we're gonna stick you in jail for 10 years. So it looked really different back then. And one of the things I love about this model is that services are provided. So it was a lot harder for me to get out and exit. It took me getting hit by a car in Las Vegas, getting ran over by a car full of other women because I was on their turf. So I was lucky to survive. You know, I came out with a broken leg and I was of no use to my trafficker, and that's what got me out. But I didn't have the services to get out, you know, and luckily I had a family who was willing to take me back in. And so not everybody has that. And so everyone's exit can look different. But if you don't have that off-ramp exit and those services, and traffickers are allowed to legally be a business owner and own a brothel,
Right.
all they're doing is providing, like you said, revenue for the state,
Right,
at the expense of humans being sold,
right,
which is a human rights violation.
mm-hmm.
They need to
And
look at it.
and people try to legalize that and want to decriminalize that, which to me is baffling. And the funny thing is, the same individuals who are more concerned about the tax revenue in their states, they would never allow their children to go through prostitution or go through those brothels, which is really, really interesting to me. And honestly, I feel like if and when, because I'm putting it out there, if and when the equality model is implemented in these states and we start to see more of these services and resources coming up for people exiting, and though we go through those programs and we get those reintegration practices in place, I guarantee that the majority are not going to return to quote unquote sex work because they have what they need to have not have been there in the first place. If they would have had what we're trying to offer before they were engaged, they wouldn't have been there. But the fact is, like you said, we didn't have those resources. When I got out, I'm younger, right? And I am not that far away from the time that I've exited. And I still didn't have those resources. I didn't have those programs that I could go to. It was jail or human trafficking court. Like there's no in between. There were no options. So I feel like if I had all of these things in place, if I had somebody that would educate me on this, if I had a resource when I was poor and on the street, when I got kicked out, when I ran away, if there were things and places I could go to, then I would not have gotten into this mess, honestly. But you know, although the debate is heavy now, I think that once we implement it and start to see the changes, then the opinions will change. but it's not until we implement it that this conversation is gonna go away. And I think that, it might suck for some people. Some people may not agree, but I think that we need to do what's in the best interest of the majority of individuals who are at risk, and not the few that oppose it.
Yeah. I know a lot of people have been talking about defund the police, and I didn't want to bring this up, but it does play into, and I'm not speaking on what I think either way, but um, with trafficking and everything, let's see. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought on that. It's a deep one. I've had a lot of debates on this lately.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, we'll skip to something else when it comes back. So I think one of the questions from the audience was as far as resources, what resources do you know of currently in New York that are working, and what could be better? Because I know, like in Seattle, I mean, I've asked a room full, of people who are involved in different things, like if you had these resources and if it was this like perfect world, of course, they're like, of course we would take this other way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not all the way there. And so, we need better counseling services. We need more housing. We need more beds for trafficking survivors. The emergency services, everything on this high scale. What would you say that New York is doing, but still needs to progress in?
I think it's very similar, actually. We lack beds, we lack beds, we lack beds, and it is so detrimental because for those who go through prostitution, they often also intersect with other issues. So they're either in prostitution and identify on the LGBT spectrum, they're in prostitution and homeless, they're in prostitution and something. And the shelters that we have here, one, are minimal. We don't have many. Two, a lot of them are shelters for DV and none for prostituted people. Or we have, I think, 2 shelters that cater to LGBT youth, which also is detrimental because after a certain age, then it's like, go back on the street, we can't help you. Or there's such a overload of kids that need help, and they don't have enough beds for the body. So they end up back on the street and they end up back into prostitution. So I think that in terms of what we do have shelters, we do have some beds, we do have some programs, especially there's a lot for children that are trafficked. We have GEMS out here. So there are programs where children can go and receive these services. In my experience, a lot of those services were introduced to me after getting arrested and going through court, and after the judge said, this is where you're gonna go. So we don't have many preventative services here, but we do have services we have a lot more services for youth under 18 than we do for adults that are exiting the sex trade. We do need housing desperately, and we need more therapy. We need counseling. We need more affordable. I mean, across the board, I think we need more affordable healthcare, but I think that we need to have more programs that focus on, if not programs, and at least trauma-informed therapists. There are so many therapists that don't have that trauma-informed certification, and I think that makes it hard for people like us to go through therapy, because the therapists don't understand the trauma that we just came from, because it's exacerbated and is definitely twice as hard as some of the other traumas that they're used to talking about. So I think that we need more funding for those resources and those services. We don't have that many here in New York, and we definitely have a lot of the same, similar issues.
Yeah, I mean, even here, mental health is something that's not invested in deeply, especially when it comes to victims of trafficking. How can someone enroll in school if their mindset isn't there? How can someone, apply for their own house and sustain a job if their mindset's not there?
Right.
So counseling and mental health is so important too. And this is a big part of the resources, I think, that need to be stepped up. And preventative work too, I worked for Seattle Against Slavery. My contract recently ended, but I was out there doing training to healthcare providers so that when, victim or survivor trafficking comes into a facility, they know how to respond. We have a program where We have a tech program. So online, we have a bot that like scrapes the numbers to the women and sends out a number to an advocate and says, hey, if you ever need help, call this number, and they can get directed to a live advocate that can help them. And then they also like try to curb buying online through this tech program.
Yeah.
There's things on so many different levels. We had a ending exploitation program, an SSE program, where the buyers, once sent through, once prosecuted, got court mandated to take a 10-week class. And so in this class, they learned about the harms of buying. They learned about what they were doing. And most of them came back, out and said, we don't want to buy again. And they've even started this, this group of men helping survive, wanting to help survivors out here in this area. I mean, it's just this realization. So, there's definitely a progressive movement in this. We're lucky to live in such a big city with, resources and some money.
Yeah.
But it can always be better.
For sure. We definitely need more I think the prevention is key, because we always focus on the reactionary measures, but never how to stop people from getting involved in the first place.
Exactly. We don't just want to triage things. We want to make sure that we can catch it upstream so that we reduce this harm, and we're not having to jump on and be like, okay, let's pull all these resources together when it could have been prevented.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. So we're nearing our time. I just wanted to talk about some topics. I know I had talked to you earlier about like, so if we're talking to a council member, or we have someone in power that's listening to this webinar series, what is our call to action? What would you say to them that you would like to be done?
Right now, I would say, because there's not that many in New York because of our legislative session, so I would definitely say, when you hear about this bill, this full decrim bill being introduced, support the equality model, or at least, at the very least, dig deeper when it comes to the decrim bill. Talk to more survivors. I think they're only hearing one side of the narrative, and they're not getting the full scope of what prostitution actually looks like. And definitely do your research. I think that if you talk to more survivors and you actually figure out the harms of decrim and how that would look in your state, in your local community, then you would be a lot more reluctant to support it.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. I'm going to see if I can pull this up as well. I don't know. I think I might be able to share this slide. There we go. Some of the things that we had talked about, I definitely agree with what you just said. We want buyer accountability. We want,
Yes.
prevention and education, and the access to an advocate. And I think that's exactly where I was going with the decrim thing, or the defund thing. If you defund, fully, we don't want to see is the special unit for trafficking victims being taken out. And so that's something we need. We need more advocates. We need someone to respond, besides a police officer, for an adult in these situations, so that they're willing to accept these services, and they have someone that's coming out that has lived it would be preferable.
Yeah.
But as far as buyer accountability, I would like to see more implementation of the stopping sexual exploitation classes that are already court mandated throughout King County. This needs to go all throughout Washington State, all throughout the United States. These classes are necessary for buyers to understand the harms that they're creating to society. And also that restorative justice to, be able to understand and then do better. And then have the option back, whatever that looks like. And also the fines and fees that are coming from these cases being reallocated to survivors, to direct service agencies, where that money can go directly to helping survivors exit if they're willing, if they want, or they can do so. I think that's so important.
Absolutely. We don't have any of these implemented currently.
Yeah.
I do think that we definitely need some SSE classes. We have a John school here. It is completely ineffective, in my opinion. We do need money allocated back into our services, because one, we already have a shortage, and then two, we need to keep investing in the few that we do have. I personally think that they need to implement some type of trafficking prevention course or seminar or something in schools. Sometimes in New York, when you hear about it being spoken about in high schools, it's usually in the form of like a guest speaker once in a blue, or like a parent on the PTA was like, I heard this seminar and I think we should talk about it, but there's nothing in the schools that are actually there and standard for everybody. And I definitely support having a 24/7 advocate because we don't have it. And oftentimes, like you said, the first responders are not people that are trained in this or that know what it looks like or know how to talk or approach that situation. If we could find a way to get funding for that, I think that would be super, super amazing.
Yeah, definitely. I think the trafficking prevention for schools, you had spoke on that upstream, catching it before we just have to triage, and just implementing that in high schools. They're getting classes on sex education and consent and talking about these things. Trafficking needs to be something that's talked about too, because this is something that is prevalent, that it does happen, and people don't talk about it, don't see it, maybe not, don't even have education on it until they get to college if they're lucky. Even when I was in college at UW, I never took a class on this. I mean, I A, lived it, but B, got my education through my internship.
Right.
Um, and so this is something that our children need to learn, be educated on.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah. Great. Well, I just want to thank you so much, Melanie, for coming today. This is a great conversation. I think the Nordic model and just a deeper understanding of what it is has really been explained. And I hope that this can reach a broad audience of people. Um, so moving forward, we are going to have a webinar, the Human Collaborative. We're going to have a webinar series. So I believe 2 or 3 weeks. If you go to our website, the next one is on the page. It's going to be Survivor Voices Elevated. So we have some amazing speakers. I believe their bios are on the page as well. So I just want to thank you again to all the policymakers and everyone who took the time out to educate yourself. That's your job. That's what we are here to do for you. So thank you so much for taking your time to come here today and listen to me and Melanie, survivors who have something to say and want a seat at the table. So
Yes,
thank
thank
you
you.
everyone for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.